Well, I'm glad that you're with us on July the 4th. I'm telling you, it's the July the 4th weekend and actually Sunday, July the 5th, but it's still the 4th of July until midnight tonight and we get over to July the 6th. I'm telling you, fireworks are everywhere. I'm sure you're tired of them already. I saw where there'll be more fireworks set off during this weekend than any other holiday, including July the 4th celebrations in the history of America. It's going to be a great, great explosion of fireworks everywhere. I mean, just about everywhere. And the fear of my heart is there are going to be a lot of deaths, a lot of people injured who are playing with fireworks who have no business playing with them and setting those things off. Nevertheless, this is a great celebration, 250 years. Who would have believed it? We are a constitutional republic. We are not a democracy. That's one of the great mistakes that people make quite often, thinking we're a democracy. We're not a democracy. The founding fathers, when they established this country, knew that it could not be a democracy. That sounds like a wonderful thing, but it's not. Now, what is a democracy? That's where all of the people make all of the decisions by a vote. Now, can you imagine for a minute, we have a population of 350 million people or thereabouts. Suppose every single decision, and there are hundreds of decisions in the course of a year that need to be made. How in the world could you get hundreds of decisions made by all the people? We have a difficult time trying to have a presidential election with 350 million people. Try multiplying that by hundreds. You couldn't do it. It'd be impossible to do it. And so what you'd do, you'd end up having anarchy or chaos, and it would just be a mess. What we have is a constitutional republic. Now, what does that mean? The people decide on what their founding documents will say by vote. And that was done almost 250 years ago. We call it the Constitution. It's sort of like the bylaws of a church or the bylaws of a corporation. It's the quote-unquote Bible of government. That's called the Constitution. And that's voted on by the people. Included in that Constitution is the election of people who will represent them in making all those hundreds of decisions. So the democracy is when all the people vote on people who are running for office who become our representatives. And in the national government, the federal government, we have a House of Representatives voted on every 2 years. And then we have senators 7 years. The House of Representatives, the number is based upon the population of the state, but each state has 2 senators, whether it's a large state or a small state. So they represent us, the House of Representatives and the senators and the president that are voted upon. They represent our will according to the Constitution. So we're a constitutional republic. It's the best kind of government. But it fails because people have a difficult time allowing themselves to be governed by it, although it's the best form of government by far. In the history of the world, there have been many constitutional republics, but the average lifetime of a constitutional republic like ours has been only 17 years. And here we are celebrating 250 years. So God had a hand in it. I truly believe that with all of my heart. Now, I'm going to show you the influence of God. Now, I mentioned some of these things when I was with you, but I found a lot of good things that I didn't mention when I was with you the other day. So I think it would be good for me to hit a couple of the highlights of what I shared about the founding of America when I was there, but add to it some very, very interesting things that show us how God really was involved in the founding of our nation. There are among the founding fathers some real highlights, some that just stand out more than the others. Obviously, the one that is called the founder of our country or the father of our country is George Washington. And I'll speak a bit about him today. He's called the father of our country, George Washington. Then another very important man that pulled a lot of strings and had tremendous influence and is not remembered too much is a man by the name of John Adams. John Adams, one of our founding fathers, was the one who went to George Washington and persuaded him. George Washington at that time was a military man. He, as a young man, had gotten involved in the militias and in the armies of that day, as primitive as they were, and he'd become a leader. And so John Adams went to George Washington and persuaded him to take over all the military, such as it was in their struggle against England. So you have John Adams, and then you have George Washington, both of them great. Benjamin Franklin was a third. What a great politician, somebody who knew how to make things happen. But the one that I mentioned when I was there that does not get enough attention was not a politician, but was a preacher. George Whitefield. You spell his name Whitefield, but it's actually pronounced Whitfield, not Whitefield. And George Whitefield had begun his ministry in England. In fact, he had originally tried to be an actor, but God got a hold of his heart. He was saved. He became very passionate about God. And in England and Europe, he preached over 13,000 sermons. Then he came to America and he preached some in Savannah, Georgia, with John and Charles Wesley, and formed down there was the Methodist Church. It was a very conservative church, not at all like the Methodist Church of today. And then George Whitefield got it in his heart about America. He really had a love for America. He was a member by birth of the United Kingdom, made several trips by ship back and forth, but he preached often in America. It is said that 80% of the American population actually had the privilege of hearing George Whitefield preach. Now, not only had he preached 13,000 sermons and more over in Europe and in the United Kingdom, he also, it's estimated, preached over 18,000 sermons in America, and during his ministry here, rode horseback over 5,000 miles, visited every single one of the 13 colonies. There is a movie out that I hope you'll see. I mentioned it when I was there. And it's a brand new movie. I saw it. I'm not big on movies, but it's a great movie to watch. It's called A Great Awakening, and it's about the friendship of George Whitefield with Benjamin Franklin. George Whitefield was an extraordinary preacher. He had an unbelievable voice. Now, what I'm about to tell you, I did not tell you all of it a couple of weeks ago, but you need to hear what I'm about to say. He had an extraordinary voice. He was a brilliant man. How good was his voice? Well, Benjamin Franklin, who became a friend to George Whitefield, had heard about him before he met him. And Benjamin Franklin, who was a scientist, had heard that George Whitefield had a voice that could be heard by 30,000 people. 30,000 people had heard him. And it was said that 50,000 to 60,000 on one occasion had heard him. Now remember, they didn't have microphones and speakers in those days. So once they met and developed some sort of a friendship in the beginning, George Whitefield was going to be preaching from the square in Philadelphia. And Benjamin Franklin decided, being the scientist that he was going to decide whether it was possible for 30,000 people to hear that man preach. George Whitefield was preaching in that open square because churches of that time did not want to have him preach in their buildings. And the reason was because he was too plain. He was too straight down the gun barrel. He was too passionate. He believed too much in his convictions. And he would call a sin a sin. And he was very upfront in his preaching. And they felt like that was taking away from the dignity and the sanctity of their holy buildings. Their preachers preached with a monotone, their sermons. Very mild-mannered sermons. Very mild-mannered sermons. And read them. And here was George Whitefield, flailing hands, pounding a pulpit. So Benjamin Franklin went to hear him. And Benjamin Franklin stood with his back turned to George Whitefield and began to walk out along a narrow street there that was cram-packed with people. Everywhere you looked around George Whitefield, front, back, sides, all of the thoroughfares, the streets, were literally crammed with people. Upstairs windows of those buildings were crammed with people looking out, trying to see him and to hear him. And so Benjamin Franklin began to walk. He just couldn't believe it. He walked what we would say would be a football field length, 100 yards. Kept walking, kept walking, kept walking, and could hear George Whitefield clearly at a half mile. And if you drew a circle of that throng which was present around George Whitefield, it would have easily been 30,000 and more, according to the calculations of Benjamin Franklin. So Benjamin Franklin was really interested in George Whitefield. Now, he heard that George Whitefield was going to be preaching at the edge of the Delaware River, which runs nearby Philadelphia. And there are places that the Delaware River is about 300 or 400 feet across. There are other places where the Delaware River is 1.5 to 2 miles wide. Now, water will carry a voice. George Whitefield stood on the side near Philadelphia. There was a throng of people stretching down the river. There was a throng of people on the other side of the river, almost 2 miles away. And Benjamin Franklin, who would not have lied because he was a scientist, said those on the other side, up to 2 miles away, could hear what he was saying. So he was a great preacher. One of the things that troubled George Whitefield, and by the way, probably is the salvation of America, because if America is America today because of any one man, it would be a preacher, George Whitefield, not a politician, not George Washington, not Thomas Jefferson, not John Adams, not Benjamin Franklin, but a preacher, George Whitefield. And what was that one thing? George Whitefield recognized that unless the people of America got together, they didn't have a chance against the mightiest army in the world, the mightiest country in the world at that time, which was England, Great Britain. He knew there was no chance. No chance whatever. And here is the reason. When the people that mostly came from Europe came to America, they were distinctive not only in their races, from multiple races. There were Irish people, Scotch people, people even from, many people aren't aware of this, Africa and Spain. People aren't aware there were people from Spain here. It was a mixed group of people. And at that time, the races didn't get along. Religions didn't get along. I mean, it was hard for the Methodist people coming from the South, where the Wesleys were preaching in Georgia, to come to a state like Delaware or Pennsylvania and do business with anybody, because they would only do business with Methodists. You had Congregationalists that wouldn't associate with other religions. The Episcopalians and the Anglicans didn't have anything to do with each other. The Catholics didn't. The Baptists didn't. There were a lot of Baptists. Pentecostals didn't have anything to do with each other. Presbyterians didn't. They were a totally divided people. Now, to make it worse, we think of South Carolina, or we think of Georgia or Pennsylvania or Delaware, Rhode Island. We think of them the way we think of states today, but they didn't think of themselves that way in those days. They were thinking of themselves as countries, individual countries. They weren't thinking in terms of a federal government. They were individual countries. They were separate, and they liked it that way. George Whitefield, the great preacher, knew this. Unless we get past that and get these 13 colonies to understand they better get unified, or that army is going to wipe them off the face of the earth. His favorite sermon was what was called his Father Abraham sermon. And I want you to look at Acts chapter 10. Acts chapter 10. And when you got it, I want you to see the one Bible verse of all the Bible. This may well be the one Bible verse that literally saved America. And I'll read it for you in a minute. The Father Abraham sermon by George Whitefield that he preached everywhere he went. He used an illustration that Father Abraham goes to heaven and he sees God. And he says, I'd like to see the Baptists. And God says, there are no Baptists here. I'd like to see the Methodists. There are no Methodists here. I would like to see the Congregationalists. There are no Congregationalists here. I'd like to see the Presbyterians. There are no Presbyterians here. And he went down the list of naming the various denominations. And then Father Abraham said, well, who do you have there? And God quoted Acts 10:35. But in every nation, he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. In every nation. And that is what George Whitefield was working toward. These 13 colonies becoming a nation. And it couldn't be a nation made up of Baptists over here and Methodists over there and Presbyterians here. It would have to be people that worked righteousness, that were centered on God, they would be accepted by the Father. So he began to preach unity. Everywhere he went on horseback, he preached on unity. We need to have unity. Now, I said that some really great men heard him preach. 80% of the American people did. George Washington was influenced by the preaching of George Whitefield, that only those who did righteousness were accepted of God. Thomas Jefferson heard him. John Adams heard him. Benjamin Franklin heard him. And they all were influenced into one united effort, is that we cannot do it as separate colonies. We must be a nation. Who fostered that idea more than anybody else? A preacher. And a word from the Word of God. And for those who are anti-church, anti-Christian, you're going to have to live with it. Because that's what happened. When George Washington became commander, he had some things on his mind. He had already been influenced by the ministry of George Whitefield. In fact, he had been in a battle in what they called at that time the Indian Wars. And he had suffered terribly at their hands. The Indians had guns instead of bows and arrows, and he was hit 4 times. I want you to listen to what he said in a letter to his brother John. By the all-powerful dispensations of providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability and expectations, for I had 4 bullets through my coat, and 2 horses shot out from under me. Yet I escaped unhurt, though death was leveling its ways into the companions with me on every side. I survived by the grace of God. Later, he met the chief of the Indians with whom he was fighting. And that chief said to him, now that they were at peace, I am a marksman. I shot you 17 times. Finally, I told my men to quit wasting their ammunition because God's Spirit was about to make you the father of a great nation. George Washington, as a result of the preaching of George Whitefield, had given himself to God. Now let me say something about George Washington and say something about every one of the founding fathers, every one of the presidents that's ever lived since that day, every congressman, every senator, every preacher, and you also. They were by no means perfect men. There are things that all of them did, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and others, with which I strongly disagree. But aren't you glad that God used them anyway? And aren't you glad that God uses you anyway? And aren't you glad of that? Take David in the Bible. He certainly did not always do as God would have wished, but his heart was in the right place. I do believe that these founders of the country had their hearts in the right place, or they wouldn't have committed themselves to the will of God as much as they did. When George Washington took over the army, his ragtag army, because there was a struggle in the United States against Great Britain, because Great Britain was taxing them, but giving them no voice in how the taxes would be taken from them or how much the taxes would be. That's what the Revolutionary War was fought over. And they knew that the only way they would ever be able to have a voice in it, they would have to go to war with Great Britain and become a separate nation. As long as they were colonies of Great Britain, they knew they had no chance. Great Britain decided they're going to take this bunch of rabble-rousers down. The mightiest invading army up to that date came into New York Harbor. There were 32 British soldiers, 400 ships that came into that harbor in 1776. George Washington and his people were there. A few months went by as they sat silently, the British, in the harbor. The Continental Congress that had met, along with George Washington, are you listening? Sent out 15 calls for prayer and fasting among the colonies of America. 15 times the Continental Congress asked the people of America to set aside at least one day, many days if they can, of prayer and fasting. Can you imagine what would happen in America today if we did this? Nevertheless, George Washington made his escape because he was about to be trapped by that mighty Jewish force. He got across the East River, and he did it at nighttime, and he knew he had to get out of there before the sun rose and the British saw him escaping. He got half of his army across, but his other half, just simply because of all the cannon and the wagons, just couldn't make it across, and they were left stranded on that side. Wide open targets for the British. If they were wiped out, it was only a matter of time until Washington's other half. He went off alone and prayed, got on his knees and prayed. And suddenly, meteorologists say even today, there was a huge fog that lasted all day long. Never seen before, historically, never seen since. And that other half of Washington's troops were able to get across the East River. So he's over on the other side. On August the 27th, 1776, there's a turncoat loyalist. That's an American who's serving the British. Contacts the British forces and tells them where Washington is. They attack 10,000 British against the Americans of about 6,000. And in injury or death, Washington lost 3,000 soldiers. On August the 29th, Washington made up his mind. We've got to do something. We've got to retreat. We've got to get it away from that advancing army. He also knew this. The Continental Congress had called for enlistments to the army. The enlistments ran out on December the 31st. They had had no major victories. If they didn't have a major victory, the people would be discouraged and it would all be over. His men were frozen in. His ragtime army absolutely frozen. But he decided on December the 25th that he was going to cross the Delaware River. The British would be thinking it's Christmas. It's a time for waiting until springtime to beat that American army. They're not going to do. The ground is frozen. They're on the other side of the river. There are big ice chunks floating down the river. Nobody will attempt that. Washington told his troops, I know you're cold. They had already lost 2 men to freezing. The other men could barely stand, barely walk. Their guns were frozen. Everything looked miserable. But George Washington knew, I need to have a surprise attack. They're entrenched, the British are, at Trenton. I've got to get across that river. He gets out into the snow, kneels in prayer, and he prays. He remembers, no doubt, based on a conversation he had later, that George Whitefield's assurance that God would be with him if he fought mightily and gave himself to God. They were able to get across that river even with ice chunks. Then they had to trudge 9 miles to get to Trenton. They caught the British totally by surprise, and they destroyed that British army, moved on to Princeton. When they got to Princeton, they had more courage because they'd won a mighty victory, even though they were still cold and worn out and tired. And they fought at Princeton. George Washington, seeing his troops begin to falter a little bit in front of that mighty British army that was still mighty because they'd gotten more troops to come in, got on his horse. He rode within 30 yards of the British who were firing in direction. He knew that he would be killed. Gunfire and smoke from gunfire, perhaps the smoke shielded him a bit. No one expected him to make it. But he became such a hero that the men for the American side took great heart and followed Washington into this massive British troop, defeated them. He went away unharmed. Was God protecting him? I think so. 30 yards from gunfire, and he was never hit. Later on, at the Battle of Yorktown, Cornwallis, the mighty British general, was defeated. He was trapped, and the Americans had won. On April the 30th, 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected to be the first president of the United States. He gave his first speech as president standing on Federal Hall in New York City on the porch. And in that speech, he gave America to God. Then he walked a few blocks south down what is now Wall Street to St. Paul's Chapel. The Congress followed him. The senators, the representatives, the Supreme Court. And they all sat together at St. Paul's Chapel, which is still located in New York. And an interesting feature, it's right across the street from where the Twin Towers were destroyed by radical Islamists. Every other building was either destroyed by the falling debris or destroyed so badly they had to finally be torn down later. Every one of them. except St. Paul's Chapel, it was unharmed. And the first sermon preached to the first Congress, first Supreme Court, and the first President of the United States was when the chaplain preached that as a united government, they were giving America to God. And that he, not George of England, but he was the only sovereign that was worthy of capital S for sovereign. All other sovereigns must bow to him. Yes, Christianity and the preacher and the Bible jump-started America. Heavenly Father, thank you for today. In Jesus' name, amen.